Daylight explodes with chaos as the farmer, mid-40s, rugged in denim and flannel, grips the excavator controls, shoving Karen's glossy SUV into the mud by the pond. Karen, mid-50s, pastel yoga outfit, sun hat, oversized sunglasses, screams in panic, waving her arms. "Stop! Don't do this!" Mud splashes, tires sink. The pond was quiet that morning. The kind of silence that makes the air feel heavier than usual. Mist curled off the water in thin ribbons, and the surface shimmered with the first touch of sunlight. I stood there with my coffee mug in hand, staring at the reflection of my barn in the pond. For years, this view had been my comfort, a symbol of peace and of the generations before me who worked this land. But that morning, the pond felt different. It felt like it was holding a secret, waiting for a moment that would change everything. I didn't say a word, but inside me, something was stirring. The sight of that calm water was both soothing and painful. It was a gaze moment, the kind where you look at something familiar and suddenly realize it's about to play a bigger role in your life than you ever imagined. I couldn't know then that the pond would soon become a stage, a witness, and in its own way, a weapon. But my gut told me something was coming, and I wasn't wrong. It all started with a car. Not just any car, but a shiny black SUV that didn't belong on my land. It glimmered like a jewel dropped in the mud, arrogant and out of place. That SUV would soon become a symbol of something larger. Of pride, of intrusion, of a fight I never asked for, but couldn't walk away from. And the woman behind it? Her name was Karen Thompson. Around here, we just called her HOA Karen. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was a force of nature, loud and relentless, the kind of person who never saw a boundary she didn't want to cross. With her clipboard, her oversized sunglasses, and her idea of community standards, she treated Meadowbrook Estates like her personal kingdom. And when she looked at my farm, she didn't see history, sweat, and family roots. She saw a blank canvas for her HOA empire, a place she could shape into her vision of order. At first, I tried to ignore her. A polite smile, a quick wave, anything to keep the peace. But patience only works when the other side respects limits. Karen had none. Every drive past my property came with a new insult. Every encounter was another reminder that she believed her rules stretched beyond her subdivision's gates. And then one day, without asking, without even pretending to ask, she parked that SUV on my hayroad, right in the middle, like she owned it. It sat there bold as brass, blocking the path where my tractor ran every day. I remember walking up to it, running my hand over the cool, polished hood, feeling both anger and disbelief. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a declaration, a dare. That SUV became a monument to her entitlement, gleaming in the sunlight, reminding me with every glance that my land, my space, my peace was being stolen inch by inch. The strangest part? I could almost hear my father's voice in my head as I looked at it. He used to say, "A farm is more than land. It's memory. It's blood. It's the one thing you defend, no matter the cost." Standing there with her car planted in my road, I felt the weight of those words pressing down on me. The SUV wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a line in the dirt. And whether Karen knew it or not, she had just crossed into something she couldn't control. But I didn't react right away. Instead, I did what farmers do best. I waited. I watched. There's a kind of quiet rage that doesn't explode all at once. It builds slowly, like storm clouds stacking on the horizon. You keep working, feeding the animals, fixing the fences, acting like life is normal. But inside, you're just waiting for the right time to strike. And as I sat on my porch each evening, sipping beer and watching that SUV glint under the moonlight, I could feel that storm getting closer. The pond became my refuge during those nights. I'd walk down, listen to the frogs croak, watch the fireflies drift across the water. The reflection of that car on the surface of the pond was almost mocking. It was as if the land itself was reminding me, This isn't hers. This is yours. That was the silent pain I carried. To outsiders, it probably looked like just a petty neighbor dispute. But to me, it was the slow theft of dignity, of respect, of legacy. And here's the part that might make you stop and think. When someone disrespects your boundaries long enough, they aren't just stepping on your property. They're stepping on your memories, your family, your very sense of self. That SUV was no longer just a vehicle. It was every insult she had thrown, every flyer she taped to my barn, every yoga mat she laid out on my hayfield. It was her arrogance made metal. I can't explain exactly when the idea took root, but one night as I walked past the pond, I stopped and stared at the water's edge. The soil there is tricky, soft underneath, waiting to swallow anything too heavy that leans too close. I crouched down, ran a handful of dirt through my fingers, and I swear it felt alive. That's when I knew. The land would help me deliver the lesson Karen refused to learn. Still, I didn't rush it. The waiting was part of the plan, part of the rebirth I didn't even realize I was heading toward. Because this wasn't just about teaching her a lesson. It was about reclaiming my ground, my voice, my peace. For too long, I'd stayed silent. But the silence had turned into something sharper now, something that demanded action. And the pond, the same pond where I'd fished as a boy, where my father once showed me how to test the soil, was going to be the place where that action unfolded. If you'd driven by my farm in those days, you might have thought everything was calm. The cows still grazed, the roosters still crowed, the sun still rose and set like it always did. But underneath something was shifting. You could feel it in the air, the way neighbors whispered at the feed store, the way Karen's SUV gleamed in the moonlight like it was mocking me, daring me. And I knew sooner or later that car would move. Not by her choice, but by mine. What happened next is something I'll never forget. It was messy, it was loud, and it was unforgettable. But before we get there, I want you to think about something. Have you ever had someone push your limits, little by little, until suddenly you realized you weren't just losing space, you were losing yourself? That's what this story is really about. It's about boundaries, pride, and what happens when patience finally runs dry. And as for Karen, she thought she was winning. She thought her SUV was proof of her control. But the land had other plans. The pond had been waiting quietly, carrying its secret under the surface. And soon it was going to take center stage in a way that neither of us could ever forget. So stay with me, because the day that SUV rolled onto my farm was the day everything changed. And the story that followed, well, let's just say it's one you won't want to miss. I still remember the first time Karen showed up at my farmer's market booth. It wasn't the SUV then, it was just her, the voice, the tone, the way she looked at me like she'd stumbled into the wrong neighborhood. I was selling eggs and honey that day, just like my dad used to. He always told me, keep it simple, son. People come to the market for real food, not fancy labels. So there I was, stacking cartons of eggs, feeling proud of the morning's work, when Karen drifted over like she was touring an exhibit. She picked up a jar of honey, squinted at the label, then wrinkled her nose. "This is quaint," she said, like she was patting a child on the head. "But don't you think the presentation could be elevated?" That word stuck with me, elevated. It was the kind of word people used when they wanted to make something ordinary sound shameful. Eggs from chickens, honey from bees, suddenly weren't enough. Karen wanted them dressed up to fit her HOA's image of lifestyle. I laughed it off back then, but looking at her SUV glinting on my hay road months later, I realized that was the beginning of the invasion. She wasn't just buying food, she was testing boundaries. The land remembers moments like that. It holds on to them quietly until they're needed again. Every time I saw her car parked where it didn't belong, I thought about my father's calloused hands lifting fence posts, about my grandfather teaching me how to mend broken wire. They built this place from the ground up, piece by piece. And now here was Karen dismissing it all with one smirk and one parked car. That contradiction was always there with her. She talked about community spirit and improving the neighborhood, but it wasn't kindness driving her. It was control. She could throw a brunch by my pond in the name of sustainable living, but it was never about honoring my land. It was about owning it in spirit, bending it to her rules. And that's what made my blood boil. One night, as the moon rose over the pond, I caught myself replaying an old memory. I was 12, standing next to my father while he looked out at the same water. He had a way of going quiet, letting the silence do the talking. Finally, he said, "Son, this land isn't just dirt. It's our proof that we belong here. One day someone's gonna test that, and when they do, you'll have to decide what it's worth to you." His words echoed in my head as I stared at Karen's SUV. That moment from the past was no longer just a memory. It was the decision I was facing in the present. The next morning, Karen doubled down. She wasn't just parking anymore. She had an audience. A group of HOA board members trailed behind her, snapping photos and jotting notes like tourists on safari. She pointed toward my barn, her voice carrying across the field. "This is what guests see when they arrive. Imagine how much better it would look painted in eggshell serenity." The others nodded obediently as if they'd been hypnotized. I walked over, mud on my boots, hay on my jacket, and said calmly, "This isn't your property. You don't get to dictate how it looks." She tilted her head, smiling like she was humoring a stubborn child. "Oh, come now. Progress is inevitable. You'll thank us later." That word again. Progress. For her, it meant erasing the grit and sweat that came with real work. For me, it meant remembering who I was and where I came from. And in that clash, her SUV became the perfect symbol. She parked it on my road not because she had to, but because it told the world she could. What would you do if someone tried to erase everything your family built, one smug smile at a time? I tried to reason with her once more, but deep down, I knew patience was running out. That night, sitting on the porch, I stared at her car under the moonlight. It looked less like a machine and more like an intruder camped out on my legacy. The frogs croaked, the ducks splashed, but my focus stayed locked on that SUV. I could feel my father's words pressing against my chest. The memory of him wasn't all gentle wisdom either. He had his own contradictions. He believed in fairness, but he also believed in teaching lessons the hard way. I remembered the day a neighbor once let his cattle graze too close to our field without asking. Dad didn't call a meeting or file a complaint. He loaded the cattle onto his trailer and dropped them back at the neighbor's doorstep with a note. "Stay on your side." That was his way. Firm but clear. And as I thought about Karen, I realized the blood in my veins hadn't skipped that trait. The next day, I saw her SUV parked even closer to the pond like she was flaunting it. She waved from the driver's seat, her sunglasses reflecting the water. "Perfect view, don't you think?" she called out. Behind her, 2 HOA members nodded, sipping lattes as if they were at a resort. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a warning. She was preparing to expand, to drag her whole HOA circus deeper onto my farm. That night I walked down to the pond again. I crouched near the soft soil, pressed my hand into the ground, and felt how easily it gave way. The pond had always been more than water. It was a reminder of survival. My grandfather dug it to keep the farm alive through droughts. It was meant to sustain life, and yet here I was, considering how it might take something away. That contradiction wasn't lost on me. A pond that once saved my family's future might now be used to save it again, just in a different way. Sometimes the very thing that gave you life becomes the only weapon left to protect it. The whispers at the feed store turned into rumors. Folks said the HOA was planning to petition the county to rezone the farmland near Meadowbrook. Others said Karen was telling newcomers the farm road was already community overflow parking. Each rumor added weight to the SUV sitting on my property. It wasn't just a car anymore, it was the first step of a land grab. I couldn't help but wonder if she believed her own lies. Maybe in her mind, she was really doing good, creating beauty and harmony where she thought there was just mud and manure. Maybe she convinced herself she was lifting the place up, even while she was tearing it down. That was Karen's contradiction. She thought her selfishness was service, her control was charity. And that made her dangerous. One evening, I overheard her giving a tour to a young couple near the pond. "We're planning community events here," she announced proudly, gesturing toward my field. "Imagine weddings, brunches, yoga retreats." The couple smiled politely, but I could see their hesitation. They knew something didn't add up. Still, Karen sold the vision with the confidence of a preacher at a pulpit. My blood boiled as I watched from the shadows. She wasn't just parking her SUV anymore. She was planting flags. Have you ever watched someone try to steal your life with a smile, while the world around them clapped in approval? That night, I couldn't shake the unease. My beer tasted flat. The stars looked dull. Even the familiar sounds of the farm felt off. I realized why. It wasn't just about the SUV anymore. It was about the slow suffocation of everything my family built. And I knew I couldn't wait much longer. But Karen wasn't finished escalating either. The next morning, a convoy of HOA vehicles appeared on the edge of my land. Clipboards, pamphlets, and even a golf cart with security stenciled on the side. At the front was Karen, megaphone in hand, sunglasses glinting like armor. She raised the device and declared, "Attention, farmer. Effective immediately. This land falls under Meadowbrook's community standards." Her voice echoed across the field as her followers clapped like they'd just witnessed history. I froze, coffee mug halfway to my lips. In that moment, the past and present collided. My father's warning, my grandfather's calloused hands, my own years of patience, all of it built to this confrontation. Karen wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was a threat. A living, breathing consequence of every time I'd chosen silence over action. As they taped violation notices to my barn and even my cow's feed troughs, something inside me snapped. This wasn't paperwork. This was war. Karen turned back, smirk on her lips, and shouted, "If you so much as touch my SUV, we'll sue you into bankruptcy." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked slowly toward my excavator, my hand trailing along the cold steel frame. The bucket glinted in the morning light, heavy and patient, like it had been waiting for this moment. I whispered under my breath, "Tomorrow, buddy. Tomorrow we show them." The ground had been prepared. The pond was waiting. And now, Karen had issued her final warning in front of her army. What she didn't realize was that her threat had only set the stage for mine, because in the end, it wouldn't be lawyers or paperwork deciding this battle. It would be gravity, mud, and steel. And once it started, there would be no going back. The consequence was clear. The SUV wasn't just in my way anymore. It was in the crosshairs. And the next move was mine. That night after Karen's megaphone stunt, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch, staring out at the SUV shining in the moonlight like a challenge carved in chrome. My farm had faced droughts, storms, even a barn fire once, but nothing had shaken me the way this did. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about pride, about being cornered in your own home. Still, underneath my anger was something I didn't want to admit: doubt. I asked myself over and over, am I really about to risk everything just to prove a point? The sound of the night carried memories with it. The frogs by the pond croaked in rhythm, and it pulled me back to when I was a boy. My father used to sit me on this very porch after a hard day, his hands rough and cracked, his words quiet but sharp. "A man's patience can't be endless," he once said. "Too much patience turns into weakness." I'd believed him, but now I wasn't so sure. Was I defending my land, or was I about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed? I poured another cup of coffee and watched the headlights of a car sweep down the road. My neighbor Mike pulled up in his old pickup and stepped out, wiping grease from his hands. Mike was one of the few who'd known my family for years. He walked onto the porch without waiting for an invite, sat down heavily in the chair next to me and let out a long breath. "Heard about your little HOA parade," he said. Word spreads fast. I didn't answer at first. I just sipped my coffee, staring at the SUV in the distance. Mike followed my gaze and shook his head. "That thing's like a trophy sitting there. She's not just parking, you know. She's daring you, trying to make you snap so she can paint you as the crazy farmer." His words cut deep because I'd already thought the same. I could almost see Karen's smirk in my mind, her HOA crowd cheering if I lost control. Still, I told him, I can't let it stand. Every day it stays there, it eats at me. Mike leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "So what's your plan? Call the sheriff again? Or something dumber?" I didn't answer right away. The excavator sat in the shed like a shadow, and I knew exactly what I was thinking. But saying it out loud felt dangerous, like giving life to a demon. "I'll handle it," I muttered finally. Mike gave me a long look. "You sound like your dad," he said. "But remember, your dad didn't have lawyers breathing down his neck or 100 phones recording his every move. Times have changed. What would you do if the only way to defend yourself could also destroy everything you've worked for?" After he left, I walked down to the pond again. The night was thick, the air heavy, the water reflecting the stars like shards of glass. I crouched at the edge and pressed my hand into the soil, soft, unforgiving, waiting. I could almost hear the earth whisper, "Just one push, and she'll learn." But then another voice rose inside me, the voice of doubt. Was I really about to sabotage someone's car? What if it backfired? What if the law turned on me instead? I stood there for a long time, torn between rage and reason. The pond that once symbolized life now felt like a mirror reflecting my own struggle. I hated Karen's arrogance, but I hated the thought of becoming reckless even more. Farmers live on balance. Too much rain, too little rain, either way the crop dies. And here I was, about to gamble with the balance of my own life. The next morning, Karen made sure to rub salt in the wound. She brought a group of yoga students onto my hayfield, their mats spread out like pastel flags on sacred ground. I watched from the fence line, my fists clenching at every laugh, every careless glance toward my barn. Karen strolled around in her sun hat, wineglass in hand, preaching about authentic rural experiences. She even pointed toward the pond, telling her audience, "This space has potential for weddings and festivals. Imagine what we could do if everyone embraced progress." Progress. That word again. It cut like a blade. I wanted to storm over, to throw every one of them off my land. But I stayed still, biting down the anger so hard I could taste blood. That was my breaking point. Not the SUV, not the flyers, not even the megaphone. It was seeing my family's pasture turned into a backdrop for her vanity. Later that day, I found Mike waiting at my fence line. He'd seen the whole spectacle. "You gonna let this keep happening?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, I've been patient long enough." He studied me for a moment. "Careful, man. You've got to choose whether you're teaching her a lesson or just burning your own house down. Sometimes the hardest fight isn't against your enemy. It's against the part of yourself that wants to go too far." That night, I sat in the excavator cab, the smell of diesel and iron filling the air. My hands rested on the controls, trembling slightly. I could almost hear my father beside me, whispering, "Patience has limits." The machine hummed under me like a beast waiting to be unleashed. I imagined nudging the ground, loosening the soil, watching her SUV slowly sink until it vanished. The thought thrilled me, but it scared me too. What if I liked it? What if it turned me into something I didn't recognize? As I sat there, lost in thought, I heard footsteps crunching on gravel. Mike appeared again, arms crossed, his face half in shadow. "You're really thinking about it, aren't you?" I didn't answer. He stepped closer, resting his hand on the excavator's side. "You do this, there's no undoing it. They'll call you reckless, dangerous, maybe even criminal. Are you ready for that?" I finally looked at him. "And if I don't, then what? They walk all over me until there's nothing left? My dad's voice, my grandfather's sweat, everything this place stands for, it all gets erased. So tell me, Mike, what's worse? Fighting back or letting it all slip away?" He sighed, eyes heavy with something like pity. "That's your choice. But just know, once you choose, you can't go back." When he left, I sat alone in the dark cab, the engine silent but the weight of the decision pressing hard. The pond glimmered in the moonlight like it was calling to me, daring me to act. What happens when the line between justice and revenge is so thin you can't see it anymore? The following morning, Karen escalated again. A convoy of SUVs rolled up, her HOA crew in tow, clipboards ready, cameras pointed at me like I was an animal in a cage. Karen stepped out, polished and smug, and announced, "From now on, this area will serve as official community overflow parking." She pointed directly at my road, her SUV gleaming behind her like a crown jewel. The crowd murmured approval, and I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't rage exactly, it was clarity. They weren't going to stop. Not with words, not with warnings. They believed their rules were stronger than my rights. And maybe, just maybe, the only way to end it was to show them the land itself still had power. I walked toward the pond, my steps heavy, my heart pounding. The crowd followed, curious, their whispers blending with the sound of the wind. Karen strutted ahead, waving her arms like a queen showing off her new kingdom. And there, at the edge of the pond, her SUV sat waiting, glinting in the sunlight like it knew what was coming. I glanced back at my barn, at the fields my father had worked, at the legacy that hung in the balance. My hands shook, but my jaw was set. I climbed into the excavator, the engine roaring to life, its growl echoing across the pasture. The HOA crew gasped, Karen scoffed, and Mike appeared again at the fence line, watching with arms folded. His face unreadable, the bucket arm lowered slowly, inch by inch. The ground beneath Karen's SUV already soft from the night's quiet preparations. The crowd shifted nervously, realizing this wasn't a show anymore. It was something far more real. Karen shouted into her megaphone, "Stop this! You'll regret it! The law's on our side!" But her voice trembled for the first time, and I caught it. That flicker of fear, that was enough to keep me moving. The excavator's arm pressed against the soil, the ground giving way. The back tires of her SUV sagged, sinking just an inch. Gasps filled the air. Karen screamed, running toward the vehicle, clawing at the door handle as if she could save it by sheer will. The crowd erupted in chaos, some shouting at me to stop, others fumbling for their phones to capture the moment. Mike's voice cut through it all, low and firm. "Think about what you're doing." I gripped the controls tighter. The roar of the engine matched the roar in my chest. This was it, the breaking point, the choice that would define everything that came after. And then the SUV lurched forward slightly, the nose dipping closer to the pond. Karen shrieked, her voice cracking, and the crowd surged in panic. For a moment, time froze. My hands trembled over the controls, sweat dripping down my temples. That's when the real threat hit me. Not Karen, not the HOA, not even the law. It was the possibility that once I crossed this line, there'd be no turning back. That the man who started this fight to protect his land wouldn't be the same man who walked away from it. The engine growled louder, the ground cracked beneath the tires, and the SUV tilted again, inch by inch, toward the water. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And then, everything snapped at once. The SUV slid half a foot forward with a sickening groan, the pond waiting like an open mouth. Karen screamed for help, the crowd scattered, and Mike shouted my name. I didn't move. My hand hovered over the controls, caught between justice and destruction, between my father's voice and my own trembling conscience. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a battle with Karen. It was a battle with myself, and as the SUV teetered on the edge, mud sliding beneath its tires, I knew the next move would decide everything. The ground was trembling under the weight of Karen's SUV, mud bubbling at the edges as if the pond itself had been waiting for this moment. The crowd stood frozen, the sound of the excavator's engine rattling their nerves. Karen clawed at the driver's side door, shrieking words I barely heard, her voice cracked with panic. I sat in the cab, my hands locked on the controls, every muscle stiff. One small movement, and it would all be over. One gentle push, and her monument of arrogance would slide into the pond where it belonged. But in that silence between heartbeats, doubt clawed at me again. My chest burned, and my father's voice came back like a ghost. A man defends his land, yes, but he must answer to himself when the fight is done. Was I ready to answer? Was I ready to carry the weight of what I was about to do? My jaw clenched so tight it hurt, and I told myself this wasn't revenge. This was protection. Still, the line between the two had blurred until I couldn't tell which side I stood on anymore. Karen's HOA crew swarmed around her like frightened birds. Some screamed for me to stop, others fumbled with their phones, recording everything. Their voices were frantic, but their eyes betrayed something else. Curiosity. They wanted to see if I'd actually do it. The thought sickened me. Was I their entertainment now? A farmer driven mad, staging a showdown against a neighbor with nothing but stubbornness and steel? Would you pull the lever if it meant saving your soul, or would you freeze, knowing you can't escape what comes next? Mike's voice cut through the noise again. He stood at the fence, arms raised, his face pale. Think, man. This isn't just her car, it's your life on the line. I looked at him, searching for something steady in his eyes, but all I saw was fear. Not fear for Karen, fear for me. That's when Karen turned, mud streaked across her yoga pants, her sunglasses crooked, and screamed at me with a fury that made her look almost unrecognizable. You'll lose everything! Your land, your freedom, your name. You'll be nothing but a criminal farmer rotting in a cell. Her words stung not because they were true, but because I could see she believed them. She was certain her rules would protect her, that her world of bylaws and petitions was stronger than mine of fences and dirt. The SUV sagged again, the back tires disappearing another inch. The pond's edge began to crumble, water seeping up like it was thirsty. The crowd gasped as one. Karen lunged at the car, clutching the side mirror like she could hold back 5,000 pounds of steel with her bare hands. For a moment, she looked less like a queen and more like a desperate woman fighting to save what she loved most. Not her community, not her neighbors, just her car. That sight almost stopped me. Almost. Because in her desperation, I saw my own reflection. I wasn't that different. I was clutching my farm with the same desperation, unwilling to let anyone trespass, unwilling to bend even a little. Her SUV was her pride. My land was mine. And now both of us were fighting to the edge of madness to prove we were right. The crowd shifted, murmuring louder, some urging her to back away, others whispering that this had gone too far. A teenage boy in the back, holding up his phone, muttered to his friend, "Man, this is gonna blow up online." And just like that, I realized the world beyond my farm was already watching. This wasn't just between me and Karen anymore. This was about to become a spectacle. When your private war turns into public theater, do you keep fighting, or do you surrender to the stage? My throat tightened, and for the first time, guilt crept in. I thought about my grandfather, the man who dug this pond by hand, who built fences post by post. Would he have wanted this? Would he have been proud of me for standing my ground, or ashamed that I'd let it come to this? My hands shook harder on the controls, sweat dripping down my temples. Karen screamed again. "You think this is strength? It's weakness! You're a coward hiding behind a machine." Her words hit me like rocks. Weakness. Coward. They cut deeper than she knew because those were the exact words my father once spat at me when I backed out of a fight as a teenager. I had promised myself I'd never hear them again. And now here they were, resurrected, echoing across the pond. The excavator growled as I pressed the lever forward just slightly. The bucket nudged the earth, loosening it, and the SUV dipped another inch. The sound of mud sucking at the tires filled the air. The crowd screamed. Karen wailed. And God help me, I almost smiled. But then I saw Mike's face. His jaw was tight, his eyes heavy, and for the first time he looked at me like I wasn't his friend but a stranger. That look pierced deeper than Karen's insults, because Mike had known me my whole life, had shared beers on this porch, had stood by me through storms and losses. If he saw me now as something dangerous, maybe I was. The SUV groaned again, shifting forward, its nose tilting toward the water. Karen shrieked, clutching the hood, begging for help, mud splashing around her shoes. Her crew didn't move. They just stood there, filming, too terrified or too entertained to step in. And in that moment I understood something chilling. No one here wanted to stop me. They wanted to see me, to see if I would become the villain they already believed I could be. What do you become when the crowd isn't cheering for your victory but for your fall? The pond bubbled louder, swallowing the edge of the road, creeping closer to the SUV's bumper. I knew I had one choice left: pull back or push forward. Retreat into patience, or embrace the consequence I'd been circling for weeks. My heart pounded, every beat like a hammer against my ribs. I thought of my father again, but this time his voice wasn't clear. It was layered with my own doubts, my own rage, my own pride. I couldn't separate his wisdom from my stubbornness anymore. All I knew was that Karen had taken too much, too far, and this was the only way I saw to end it. I pushed the lever forward again. The bucket dipped into the soil, scooping just enough to unbalance the ground. The earth gave a sickening crack, and the SUV lurched violently, its nose plunging lower. The front bumper scraped the water, ripples spreading like the first notes of a song no one could stop. The crowd screamed, scattering back. Phones waved wildly, capturing every second. Karen wailed, mud smeared on her face, mascara running like ink. She shouted words I couldn't hear, her voice drowned out by the roar of the engine and the groan of metal sinking. I sat frozen, watching her car slip closer to the pond's mouth. My chest heaved, but my hands wouldn't leave the controls. This was the turning point. There was no undoing it. Whether I stopped now or kept going, the damage was already done. My life, my reputation, my peace, it was all tied to this moment. Mike shouted my name again, louder this time, almost a plea. But I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy. I wanted to tell him this was justice, that I had no choice. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew I did have a choice. I just didn't like the cost of either one. The SUV shifted again, its headlights reflecting in the murky water like drowning eyes. Karen slipped in the mud and fell, her screams muffled as she scrambled back up, covered in filth. For the first time, she didn't look powerful. She didn't look like the Queen of Meadowbrook. She looked broken, and part of me wondered if that was enough. If breaking her pride was all I needed, not sinking her car. But then I looked at the pond again, at the soft soil trembling under the weight, and I knew it was too late. The ground had made its decision, and I was just the hand that set it in motion. The excavator roared, the bucket lowered one final time, and the SUV slid forward with a groan that echoed across the farm. Its nose dipped into the pond, water splashing high, mud sucking greedily at the tires. The crowd gasped, phones flashing, voices rising in chaos. Karen screamed like the world was ending. And me? I just sat there staring numb, because I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The SUV was sinking. The crowd was screaming. The land was swallowing, and I was no longer sure which side of myself had won. The splash of the SUV hitting the pond echoed across the farm like a gunshot. Mud and water sprayed up, coating Karen's screams in a spray of filth. The crowd stumbled back, gasping and shouting, their phones raised high as if this was some twisted movie premiering live. For a second, I couldn't hear anything except the roar of my own heartbeat. I'd done it. The thing I'd thought about, hesitated over, dreaded, and wanted all at once. It was real now. There was no undoing the sight of her shiny black SUV sinking nose first into the murky water. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt hollow. My hands shook on the excavator controls, and I couldn't tell if it was adrenaline or regret. Karen thrashed at the edge of the pond, screeching threats, mascara dripping like war paint. The HOA crew scattered and regrouped in a huddle, whispering frantically, some pointing at me, some at the sinking vehicle. And then I saw Mike. He wasn't cheering. He wasn't relieved. He was staring at me with a look I'd never seen before. Disbelief, even betrayal. He shook his head slowly, his arms folded tight across his chest. That look pierced deeper than anything Karen had ever said. He'd been my friend for years, and now he looked at me like he didn't know me at all. What cuts deeper than an enemy's insult is the silence of a friend who no longer stands with you. The SUV groaned again as the pond swallowed its wheels. The crowd gasped, and Karen shouted something about lawsuits, jail, and destruction of property. I barely heard her. My focus was locked on Mike. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on gravel, not even glancing back. That hurt worse than all of Karen's noise. The sinking continued, but suddenly the spectacle wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about me. My choices, my breaking point, and the fact that I'd crossed it. I climbed down from the excavator, my legs unsteady, my breath ragged. The crowd pulled back as I approached, like I was radioactive. The whispers hit my ears. He's crazy. He's dangerous. He really did it. Karen pointed at me with shaking hands. You'll pay for this. Everyone here is a witness. You're finished. Her voice cracked with hysteria, but behind it was something else, fear. She wasn't invincible anymore. She was humiliated, desperate, drowning in mud as much as her car was drowning in water, and yet that wasn't the twist I felt building. Something was shifting beneath the surface, something I hadn't seen coming. The sheriff's cruisers rolled up 20 minutes later, sirens off but lights flashing. The crowd parted, shoving phones in the deputies' faces, each person desperate to tell their version of the story. Karen flailed toward them, her hands smeared with mud, shouting, "Arrest him! He tried to kill me! He destroyed my car!" I stood still, my arms at my sides, calm in appearance but storming inside. One deputy asked the usual questions. Whose land was this? Who owned the vehicle? Had there been warnings? I pulled the laminated deed from my truck, just like my father had taught me to keep close for times like these. The deputy studied it, nodded, and handed it back. Karen sputtered, "But it's rural access land." The second deputy laughed outright. "That's not a thing, ma'am. For a moment I thought I was safe, that the truth of ownership would shield me. But then I caught sight of Mike again, standing off to the side, talking low to one of the deputies. His gestures pointed toward me, his voice urgent, his expression grim. My stomach dropped. Mike, my neighbor, my drinking buddy, the one who had warned me to be careful. He was giving a statement against me. What do you do when the man you trusted with your secrets decides to hand them over to your enemy? The deputy came back, his face unreadable. Sir, we'll need to file a formal report. Multiple witnesses claim you used heavy machinery to push the vehicle. My throat tightened. They weren't wrong. My fingerprints were all over it. My excavator still warm from the work. And now, thanks to Mike, my own story was unraveling. Karen, sensing a shift, straightened her muddy clothes and lifted her chin, her confidence flickering back. See, even his friend knows what he did. You can't let him get away with this? I glared at Mike across the crowd. He met my eyes but didn't flinch. His jaw was tight, his face pale. He wasn't doing this because he hated me. He was doing it because he thought it was right. That made it worse. He believed I'd crossed a line too far, and in his own way, he was protecting the land, the community, maybe even me from myself. The deputies calmed the crowd, writing notes, snapping photos of the pond and the half-submerged SUV. They didn't cuff me, but they didn't clear me either. This isn't finished, one of them said before pulling Karen aside to hear her screeching version of events. As the law dealt with Karen, I walked back to the porch, my boots heavy. The farm felt different now. The air was thick with tension, the cows restless in the pasture, the ducks scattered from the noise. My land didn't feel like home, it felt like a crime scene. And then the real twist came. That evening, after the crowd dispersed and Karen had been dragged off sobbing about insurance claims, Mike came back. He didn't stand on the porch. He stayed by the fence, his face shadowed. You know they'll use this against you, he said quietly. Karen's got money, lawyers, the whole HOA behind her. They'll drag you through the courts. I didn't answer. I just stared at him, waiting for him to explain why he'd turned on me. He sighed. I told the deputy the truth. I couldn't lie for you. Not about this. You didn't just defend your land, you escalated. You gave her exactly what she wanted. Those words stung. I wanted to scream that I had no choice, that patience had run dry. But deep down I knew he was right. Karen's SUV in the pond wasn't just humiliation for her, it was ammunition for her. Proof she could twist into whatever story she needed. Sometimes the victory you fight for becomes the very weapon your enemy uses to destroy you. I turned away from Mike, my chest burning. He wasn't my friend anymore, not in this fight. He was a mirror, showing me the parts of myself I didn't want to see. The stubbornness, the pride, the willingness to cross lines and call it justice. The days that followed grew darker. News spread fast. Videos of the sinking SUV hit the internet, turning me into both a local hero and a villain, depending on who you asked. Karen used every platform she could to paint herself as the victim. Her voice trembled in interviews, her hands waved over imagined dangers. She spoke about unsafe farmers and hostile neighbors, while her supporters nodded. Meanwhile, I walked the fields alone, fixing fences, feeding cattle, pretending life was normal. But it wasn't. Every creak of the barn door, every moo of the cows reminded me of the chaos that had breached my land. And in the distance, the pond glimmered with its new secret, a half-sunken SUV mocking me every time the sunlight hit it. Karen wasn't backing down. The HOA wasn't retreating. And Mike, my neighbor, my friend, had become something else entirely. Not an enemy, but not an ally either. He was a reminder that this wasn't black and white. That maybe, just maybe, I'd become part of the problem. The story had shifted. What began as a fight against arrogance had become something more complicated, more dangerous. And the worst part was knowing the darkest moment hadn't even arrived yet. Because if Karen could twist my actions into a weapon, then the real battle, the one that would decide not just my land but my legacy, was still to come. The pond had grown quiet again after the chaos. But it wasn't the kind of quiet I used to love. It was heavy, full of eyes that weren't there. Every time I walked past it, the half-sunken SUV seemed to stare back at me, headlights reflecting like drowning eyes that refused to close. Neighbors slowed their trucks on the road, strangers stopped to take pictures, and the story spread faster than wildfire. By the end of the week, I wasn't just the farmer down the road anymore. I was the man who sank Karen's car. The internet didn't help. One video showed Karen wailing in mud, another caught me sitting calm in the excavator. To some, I was a hero, standing against the tyranny of HOAs. To others, I was reckless, dangerous, a man who'd gone too far. And through it all, Mike's words stayed with me. You gave her exactly what she wanted. Karen played the victim better than anyone. She staged interviews at the edge of Meadowbrook, wearing clean clothes, her voice trembling as she described the trauma of watching her SUV vanish. She talked about danger, community safety, even compared me to a domestic terrorist. Her HOA crew nodded behind her, clipboards in hand, as if grief could be measured in bylaws. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. Not when I knew how many people were listening. Not when I saw the way her words spread like poison. Turning my neighbors cautious, making the sheriff drive by more often, putting a shadow over everything my family had built. One night, I sat on the porch with a beer in my hand and my heart pounding harder than the crickets could sing. I wasn't proud of what I'd done anymore. I wasn't sure if it was justice or revenge. I thought about my father's words, about patience, about standing your ground, and wondered if I'd betrayed both. What if the battle you thought you were fighting for justice ends up leaving you ashamed of the man in the mirror? The breaking point came the following Saturday. Karen didn't just come back with her crew. She came with a lawyer. A tall man in a pressed suit holding a folder thick with papers walked straight onto my land beside her. I stormed out of the barn, my fists tight, ready to throw them both back to Meadowbrook. But before I could speak, he raised his voice. You are hereby notified of a lawsuit filed against you for property damage, harassment, and emotional distress. Karen smirked behind him, her sun hat tilted, her eyes gleaming with victory. You're finished, farmer. You'll lose everything. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just HOA games anymore. This was the law. And law didn't care about pride or patience. Law cared about paperwork, signatures, judges in robes. And suddenly, all the mud and sweat I had used to protect my farm felt powerless against a piece of paper. But something inside me refused to bow. I stepped forward, staring Karen dead in the eye. You think papers scare me? You came onto my land. You parked on my road. You held parties on my field. That's the truth, and no lawyer in the world can erase it. For a moment, her smile faltered. Just a flicker. Enough for me to know she wasn't as certain as she wanted to appear. That night, the farm was restless. The cows bawled louder than usual, the ducks refused to settle near the pond. I sat in the dark kitchen, the papers spread out before me, the clock ticking too loud. I could fight this in court, risk everything, or I could fold and let Karen claim a victory that would stain my family's name forever. Neither choice felt like survival. Then came the knock at the door. It was Mike. His face was worn, his eyes heavy, his jaw tight like he'd rehearsed the words before walking over. They're not stopping, he said. Karen's pushing this until you break. I already broke, I muttered. No, he said sharply. Not yet. But you're close, and if you go down, you're taking all of us with you. The rest of the town, the farmers, everyone who stands on their own land without gates or bylaws. If you lose, she wins for all of them. I looked at him, anger and confusion swirling together. So what? You're here to tell me I screwed up? He shook his head. I'm here to tell you we can't fight her with mud and machines. We fight her with truth. Sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't force. It's the truth spoken where lies expect silence. The next morning, Mike surprised me. He showed up with boxes, Old surveys, land records, conservation easement papers my father had filed decades ago. Your pond, he said, pointing at one document, isn't just a pond. It's federally protected wetlands. If she hosted events there, if her HOA set foot there without permission, it's not just trespassing. It's a violation that carries federal fines. My chest tightened as I read. He was right. My father had been smarter than I ever knew. He had signed documents that gave this farm protections no HOA could bulldoze. Karen had marched her wine and yoga classes right into the jaws of federal law. The next confrontation was unlike the others. Karen came back with her megaphone, her crew, her smugness. But this time I didn't bring the excavator. I brought the papers. When she started yelling about community standards, I held them up and spoke loud enough for every clipboard to hear. This land is a conservation trust. Every yoga mat, every brunch table, every car you've parked here is a violation punishable by $50,000 fines per incident. You haven't just trespassed. You've broken federal law. Silence. The kind of silence that hangs heavier than shouting. Karen's face paled. Her lawyer shuffled nervously, scanning the papers I handed him. The crowd shifted, uncertain, their loyalty wobbling. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to recover. You're bluffing. You're just a farmer. With proof, I cut in, slamming the deed against her megaphone. My family protected this land long before you built your gates. You thought you could rewrite the rules, but these rules, they're bigger than both of us. For the first time, Karen didn't have an answer. She stood frozen, her SUV's roof barely visible behind her in the pond, her empire crumbling as quickly as the road beneath it. What happens when the battle you thought you owned flips, and suddenly you're the one on sinking ground? The crowd murmured louder, doubt spreading through them like fire in dry grass. Her own allies backed away, whispering that they wouldn't risk federal fines, that they hadn't signed up for this. Even her lawyer's confidence faltered. Mrs. Thompson, he said stiffly, we'll need to reevaluate our approach. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her sunglasses slipped down her nose, her face flushed red, her power draining out like water from a cracked bucket. The emotional climax wasn't the SUV sinking. It wasn't the crowd cheering or the sheriff nodding at my deed. It was this moment, Karen realizing she wasn't untouchable, that all her arrogance, all her posturing had led her straight into her own undoing. I stood tall, my voice steady. You trespassed. You disrespected. You thought your rules stretched beyond your fences. But this land doesn't answer to you. It never did. Her crew dispersed quietly, their clipboards lowered. The crowd melted back toward Meadowbrook, leaving Karen alone, trembling, staring at the pond where her pride still gurgled under the surface. The fight was over. At least, that's how it looked. But when the last car rolled away and the dust settled, I sat back on my porch with the papers spread on the table and a weight pressing harder than ever. I'd won the battle, but the victory didn't feel sweet. It felt sharp, like swallowing glass, because the truth was Karen had pushed me to a place I didn't recognize in myself. I'd crossed lines I swore I'd never cross, felt rage I didn't think I had, and nearly lost the man my father raised me to be. The land was safe. The pond was still mine. But as the sun sank, I wondered if I'd given up something far greater, my peace, my patience, maybe even my soul. And then, just as the last light faded, I saw headlights in the distance. A single car creeping down the road, stopping at the fence. My chest tightened as I recognized the figure stepping out. Not Karen this time. Someone else. Someone who had been watching all along. The headlights held steady at the fence line, cutting across the pasture like two sharp eyes in the dark. I stayed on the porch, my elbows resting on the old wood table, the papers still spread before me like relics of a war I never asked for. My chest tightened when the figure stepped out of the car. It wasn't Karen. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Mike. For a moment, neither of us moved. The cicadas filled the silence, their steady rhythm reminding me that time hadn't stopped, even though everything else felt like it had. Finally, he walked toward the porch, his boots crunching on gravel, his shadow stretching long under the porch light. "You won," he said simply, his voice low, almost tired. I shook my head. "Did I?" He sighed, leaning against the post at the bottom of the steps. "Karen's finished. The HOA's backing off. They'll lick their wounds. Maybe try again somewhere else. But here? You held your ground." "That's not nothing." I looked past him out at the pond. The roof of Karen's SUV was still visible, just barely, like a scar on the water's surface. "I lost more than I held," I muttered. "I lost myself in it." Mike didn't argue. He just stood there, his silence heavier than words. Days turned into weeks. The lawsuit dissolved quietly once the papers about the Conservation Trust made their way into the right hands. Karen stopped showing her face in Meadowbrook. Rumor was she sold her house and moved on to a different community where her rules might mean more. The HOA held one last meeting and never bothered me again. But the cost lingered. My name carried weight now, not the kind I wanted. In town, some folks nodded with respect when they saw me. Others crossed the street, whispering to each other about the farmer with the excavator. Children dared each other to ride past my gate at night. The legend of what happened grew bigger than the truth, and through it all, the pond stayed quiet. A mirror in the daylight, a dark mouth at night holding what it had taken. I tried to go back to normal. Feeding cattle at sunrise, mending fences, planting seed. The rhythm of farm life is steady, but my heart wasn't. Every time I touched the soil, I wondered if I'd defended it or stained it. Every time I heard the excavator roar to life, I remembered the roar of the crowd, the gasp as Karen's SUV slid forward. One evening, I walked down to the water's edge. The air was still, the frogs silent. The reflection of the sky stretched across the surface. I crouched down, pressed my hand to the mud, and let it seep through my fingers. My father's voice returned, softer this time, less like a command, more like a memory. "Patience can't be endless, son. But don't let the fight become bigger than the land itself." For the first time, I understood. The land had survived. I had survived. But the fight had taken something out of me that no deed or survey could restore. Mike came by less often. We weren't what we used to be. Trust doesn't grow back overnight. Sometimes it doesn't grow back at all. But every now and then he'd lean against the fence, arms crossed, and we'd share a quiet moment. Not friends the way we were, not enemies either. Just two men who'd seen too much of each other in a fight that neither of us really won. The seasons changed. Summer dried into fall, leaves tumbling across the pasture, the pond colder, darker. Karen's SUV was finally pulled out, leaving ruts and mud that took weeks to settle. But in a strange way, the water seemed calmer without it, as if the pond itself had been holding its breath too. Life went on. The cattle grew fat, the fields turned gold, and neighbors found new gossip to spread. Meadowbrook planted flowers at its gates, pretending nothing had happened. But those who'd stood by the pond that day, they remembered, and so did I. What do you do when the land you saved no longer feels like the same land you knew? I found myself walking more often at dusk, when the sun stretched long shadows over the fields. There's a stillness then, when the day exhales and the night hasn't yet drawn its breath. In that stillness, I could almost forget the shouting, the lawsuits, the cameras. I could almost feel the farm the way it used to be. Quiet, steady, patient. But even in those moments, the truth pressed on me. I had won, yes, but the win had cost pieces of me I wasn't sure I'd get back. Pride had saved the land, but pride had also driven me to the edge of losing it. And that edge is sharp. Once you've stood on it, you don't forget. Magical engagement line number 2. Every victory carves a scar, and some scars don't fade, no matter how much the land heals. The final time I saw Karen was months later, in the grocery store parking lot. She didn't look like the woman with the megaphone or the Queen of Meadowbrook. She looked smaller, thinner, her sunglasses hiding eyes that refused to meet mine. She loaded her bags quickly into a different SUV and drove off without a word. I stood there watching her taillights vanish, realizing that sometimes the strongest revenge is survival. She was gone. The farm was still here. That was enough. The pond remains. The soil remains. The farm remains. But I've changed. Maybe that's what fights like this do. They strip away the illusions until all that's left is the bare truth. Land is not just property. It's history. It's pride. It's pain. And when someone tries to take it, you don't just fight for dirt. You fight for the pieces of yourself buried in it. One night, as the wind bent the tall grass and the moon hung heavy above the barn, I sat back on the porch and thought of everything that had passed. The shouting, the mud, the betrayal, the silence that followed. And in that quiet, I realized the farm was both stronger and lonelier than before. Sometimes the land outlives the battles, but the battles live on inside the man who fought them. Now, when people ask about the story, I don't give them the details. I just tell them the truth. A neighbor tested the limits of patience, and the land answered back. They can make of it what they want. Some will cheer, some will judge. But I know the cost better than anyone. The final image isn't of Karen, or the excavator, or even the pond swallowing her car. It's of me standing alone in the field at sunrise, the soil cold under my boots, the air crisp with promise. The land still here, the fences still upright, the cattle still grazing. Life continues, but with the weight of memory stitched into every corner of it. That's the story. Not just of Karen, not just of Meadowbrook, but of what it means to hold your ground when no one else will. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt the weight of standing alone against something bigger than you, I'd ask you to subscribe, share this video, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. This channel, HOA Truth Tales, is about more than drama. It's about the battles people fight behind their fences, the quiet wars that never make headlines but shape lives forever. And maybe, just maybe, it's about reminding each other that sometimes holding your ground is all you can do. The pond is still, the farm endures, and I remain, changed, scarred, but unbroken.